Millions of sailors have been to Marsh Harbour in the Abacos of the Bahamas. We love this place. 3 years ago, Hurricane Dorian removed it from the map. It was like a bomb went off. The devastation was incredible. Now, 3 years later, Wildchild is making her way back into Marsh Harbour. Let's go explore. Let's see how they're doing 3 years after. Wildchild's coming into Marsh Harbour now. Last time we were here was before Hurricane Dorian, when this place got destroyed. I'm very curious to see how much is left, how much has been rebuilt, and how much damage remains. Let's go explore. Three years ago, Hurricane Dorian hit Marsh Harbour. It went off like a bomb and destroyed almost everything here in Marsh Harbour. But you can see, some homes have been rebuilt, some homes have not. Life has returned as people do. It's the next morning and the girls of Wildchild are getting ready to go on a land adventure to visit Marsh Harbour. You can't feel it at home, but 30 degrees Celsius at 70% humidity is hot, sweaty, and uncomfortable. When it's this hot on the boat, I always wait until the last minute to put my clothes on because I'm just going to soak them through with sweat. The last time Wildchild was in Marsh Harbour was 3 years ago, which was just a few months before Hurricane Dorian rearranged the landscape. If you've seen any of the news footage, it looked like a bomb went off on here. 20-foot storm surge pushed 20-foot waves and basically buried the island underwater, washed everything away. The winds, sustained winds over 100 knots. Hurricane Dorian came over top of Marsh Harbour and sat here for 2 whole days with winds well over 100 knots, and then slowly wandered off towards Florida. The devastation to Marsh Habour Bahamas was enormous. It'll be interesting to see 3 years later how much of Marsh Harbour has been rebuilt. What is the aftermath like 3 years later? How much damage still remains? How well has life moved on? The dinghy is launched and ready to go, so let's go to shore. There used to be a building on this marina slip beside the government dock. They rebuilt the dock, but you can see many of the buildings are blown out and never got rebuilt. The dinghy dock used to be on this side. It's clearly long gone. But this new dock on this side has been rebuilt higher off the waterline, and cruisers seem to be using it as the dinghy dock. Most of the docks that were in the bay all got completely destroyed or ruined. All that's left now is the pilings. Very few of them have been rebuilt. The locals are still working on rebuilding. Even years later, the damage still shows. Many of the houses still blown out. The second floor of this house still missing, blown away by the hurricane. But across the street on the bay, they've done a beautiful job rebuilding the bar. Local entrepreneurs doing their best to bring jobs and tourist dollars back in. We walked around exploring, and it's still quite sad to see how much devastation remains 3 years later. Three years on, and the waterfront devastation of Hurricane Dorian is still rather apparent. Life returns as it always does, but it seems that the rebuild in Marsh Harbour is going very slowly. It appears that some buildings were built stronger than others and had the money to rebuild after the hurricane. Some places repaired, some places not. Locals everywhere are still working to rebuild the buildings of their city. There used to be a walkway across here. It's all been washed away though. It seems apparent in the aftermath that some wealthy people had the money and the will to rebuild. Most of the locals did not have the money to rebuild, and a lot of people just decided that they want to get out. That's enough, trying to sell. It is apparent that there are rebuilding plans in the works, but as for structures for cruisers, most of the facilities are still completely wiped away. The storm surge would have been so high that the front of this building would have been smashed in and completely underwater. The current owners are looking to dump the property and get out of it. Dream Yacht Charters is up and running again, as best they can. They put siding over metal shipping containers and made it the new office. Some of the wealthier places had money to rebuild. Most of the locals can't afford to rebuild. Most of the local structures remain in ruins. Even 3 years on, most of the structures are not rebuilt. The building has been restored. It's rebuilt and in beautiful condition, but sometimes the owners just want out. And once you get away from the waterfront and the touristy areas, this is where the locals live. You can see there's still damage to the buildings, but they're living here. You can see a pallet of blocks here where somebody's planning to repair or renovate something and just hasn't gotten around to it. See the local cars that still in place where they got destroyed by the hurricane and were flooded underwater are now basically just salvaged wrecks. And some places did have money to renovate and rebuild, like this attorney's office, good as new. Around, but I don't recognize anything. I felt like, wasn't this the hardware store? But maybe it wasn't the hardware store. Maybe I'm on the wrong road. Maybe this isn't the main road. I don't really know where I am. I know that few of you are going to recognize this, but this is where the hardware store was. However, the building used to be out to here. This used to be the main entrance to the hardware store. The whole front of the store got blown off, and now they've refronted it like this. Here, we'll go inside and I'll show you what it looks like inside. The hardware store 3 years later is still in the process of trying to reopen, trying to rebuild, and trying to stock their shelves. This used to be like a dollar store. If any of you remember Marsh Harbour and the Commonwealth Bank, this is what we see now when we look across the street. This used to be a busy downtown core. Almost everything is destroyed. Three years later, and so much of Marsh Harbour really has not been rebuilt at all. This used to be the other bank. That used to be the gambling establishment. It's hard to believe that after COVID-19 and a hurricane, you wouldn't even recognize the place. Nothing is the same here at all. Three years later, and much of it still looks like this. The bay is way over that way. When Hurricane Dorian hit, the storm surge was so high. This ship got stranded probably 300 meters from the shoreline. I have never experienced a hurricane personally, but I constantly sail through places years after the hurricanes hit, and the devastation is enormous. 3 years later, and it's sad, but Marsh Harbour is still a mess. But life is trying to go on. Well, it's good to know that the grocery store survived and is up and running.